Alright everybody, I've been telling you from the beginning that I was going to show you a way to fix some segments that didn't come out exactly right. And you know, sometimes things just happen that way. Sleds can get off, the wood can be, you know, a little more bowed than we would like when we use it, and unfortunately sometimes these miters don't exactly add up. Well, there is a way to fix it. Now, you would think you might have to recut each individual segment. Well, that's nearly impossible, not to mention very dangerous. So the way that I like to fix it is to, of course, dry fit everything together. I always dry fit every ring together to make sure that there's no problem. If there is, this is what you do. You simply glue the two halves together, but don't put glue, you know, in the middle joint. But what you do want to put in there is some kind of a round spacer. Now, you could certainly use a wood dowel. I do not prefer that because they are wood. I feel they compress too much. And the idea that you're trying to do here is essentially create two fulcrums or two pivot points. And again, the idea here is that these two halves will pivot on these points, and what you will get is a nice tight joints on all these six and on these six. And so any error, any slop is going to come out right here, and we'll fix that later. So what I like to use is actually some old router bits. That's what I have in here now, and I've just got some masking tape on top just to further protect myself. Even though they are shot, they still tend to cut you. You know, you could go and buy like a length of brass rod if you want. Some drill bits work fine. It's important though that they be the same diameter, and 1/4 inch seems to work very good for me, so that's what I like to use. Another thing I want to point out though is, of course, they're drove in from the top, but they also extend out the bottom. And I feel that if they were just put in flush, they could indent the wood more. I like them to definitely stick out the entire width. That way you get nice even pressure. And the way I actually do that is I take them over to my table saw and put it into my miter slot and just hammer them down because they are in a straight line, and that just knocks them a little bit below the surface. So you let that dry, and we move on to the next step. And I'm going to show you right now how to fix the two halves. Okay, welcome back to the lathe. And this is one of the methods that we can use to flatten the rings. And basically all I've done is created a large disc sander. I took a piece of MDF, 1 inch thick, so it's nice and stiff and rigid, 16 inches across, put some sandpaper on it, and I built a simple little base here. And just some scrap material, plywood mostly, a keyway to fit into the bed of the lathe, and then a handle up here to lock it in place. And basically the idea is very simple. Just turn on the lathe. You will take each half of the ring, make sure you're on the down side, and you know, just lightly work it back and forth as it's spinning, and that'll true up your face. You do the other side, you put them together, now you have a perfect ring. Now this is one way to do it. This is actually not the way I prefer to do it, but I will show you another way, and that's actually over at the table saw. Okay, well, check out this rig. This is my preferred method for facing my rings. And basically you have just a substrate. You could certainly use plywood if you wanted. I made mine out of something a little bit thicker. And we have a runner on the bottom. And here's a neat little trick that I started doing. I use pine. I know most people say, you know, definitely use a hardwood, and you certainly could. But what I like about using the pine is it allows me to add these little screws, and I use the rounded head, I guess a pan head type screw. And I purposely make my runner undersized so that when I add my screws, I can now individually dial these screws in and get a very snug fit. Hardwood works, but of course if you start adding screws, it tends to split, being this thin. And you know, again, you could certainly use the nylon like we did on the actual segment sled. That would work, but this is something I made a while back before I started using the nylon runners, and it's just worked fine for me, so I see no reason to change it. So we simply put it in our miter slot, like so. Of course it slides, and you can probably guess how this works. We take our ring and we slide it in, and you want it to stick over just enough. I mean, you want the I guess the most tapered end to stick over just, you know, a hair. and take your runner, you tighten it down. Again, there's one of those like T-nuts in the bottom, and just a board with a hole drilled through it, handle that I can tighten it down, and of course loosen. And I have different thicknesses of these boards depending on how thick the ring needs to be. So you simply tighten it down, of course turn on the saw, and you will run it straight through, and that will clean up the face. So, you know, it works really good. It's much faster, and I think it's a lot more accurate. And a little tip though about facing your rings either on the table saw or on a disc sander over there is I always mark my ring halves. You know, put an X on this side, of course an X on that side. And what I do is I will run one with the ring up, or excuse me, with the X up, the other one I'll run with the X down. And that way, if this blade is not exactly 90 degrees, maybe it's a 1/4 degree off or so, it will compensate, and both of them will be off the same, but a mirror image, so that they will come together nice and tightly. And again, do that for the disc sander. And also, you know, if you're ever just edge gluing boards, it's a good trick to use on the joiner too. Again, mark all your faces with an X, run one again, you know, outside the fence, one facing inside the fence. And any deviation in the angles will basically X themselves out, and you'll get a perfect joint every time. So again, that's how to fix a you know, a couple of segments that didn't come out exactly right. Now, while that method does work very well, of course there are some consequences. So let's say, for instance, we had to take a 1/16 off each half of a ring. Well, we've effectively moved 1/8 of an inch. So what used to be a circle is now more of an oval shape. Now, typically, that's not a big deal. If you recall, when we were designing our bowl, we left some extra on either side of our bowl lines, you know, when we were drawing our rectangles. And that's just for this sort of thing. Now, if you're doing a, you know, basically a plain ring like this one, again, it's really no big deal. And there should be enough material left to go ahead, true it back up once it is finally assembled, and you'll probably never know. Now, what if you're doing a feature ring and you're trying to do some diamonds like this, or say something like this? Now we have a problem, because when you have something to basically compare against, you'll see the error. Now, you could try and space your diamonds or whatever it is you are adding for a feature far enough apart to where it may not be noticeable. But a lot of people like to do their diamonds where they basically just come together and basically kiss. So if you were having to cut some material out, you know, that's not going to work. So for something like that, you definitely want to spend a little bit extra time, do a lot of test cuts, and make sure your jigs are absolutely perfect. And again, this is not basically an excuse to just start cutting material. You always want to make sure your jig is set up as accurately as possible. So, you know, weigh your options. Again, if you're doing some solid pieces, you know, you probably get away with it. But once you start getting in those feature rings, do your test cuts.